October 14, 1943, Schweinfurt, Germany. 291 American bombers crossed the English Channel at 25,000 feet. By sunset, 60 are lost forever. 121 limp home riddled with bullet holes, wings shredded, fuselages punctured, some planes carrying 50 holes or more. At secret facilities across America, mechanics work around the clock, patching metal, reinforcing wings, armoring every spot where German bullets tore through aluminum. The logic seems bulletproof. Protect where the damage is heaviest. But in a classified room at Columbia University, a 41-year-old Hungarian refugee stares at damage reports that everyone else reads the same way. Abraham Wald sees something that makes his blood run cold. The holes everyone's counting, they're telling the wrong story. While mechanics frantically armor wings and fuselage exactly where the holes are clustered, Wald realizes they're making a fatal mistake. The evidence everyone trusts is hiding the deadliest truth of the war. The planes they're studying survived for a reason, and that reason is about to flip everything the military knows about keeping pilots alive. The most important bullet holes are the ones they never see. The morning after Schweinfurt brought a silence that settled over airfields across England like fog. Ground crews moved between the skeletal remains of flying fortresses, with the careful precision of surgeons, cataloging damage that told stories no one wanted to hear. At Grafton Underwood, Technical Sergeant Jimmy Martinez counted 47 bullet holes in a single B-17 starboard wing, each puncture surrounded by twisted aluminum petals where 20mm cannon shells had torn through. The plane had made it home. Barely. 3,000 miles away in a nondescript building on Manhattan's Upper West Side, the Columbia University Statistical Research Group operated under classification so secret that most of the brilliant minds working there couldn't discuss their projects with spouses or roommates. The war had transformed academic departments into weapons laboratories, turning theorems into tactical advantages and statistical models into instruments of survival. Here, mathematics meant the difference between 25% of bomber crews completing their tours and something approaching 50%. The morning briefing room buzzed with the controlled urgency that had defined wartime. Academia since Pearl Harbor. Professor W. Allen Wallace, the group's director, spread reconnaissance photographs across a mahogany table that had once hosted faculty wine tastings. Now it displayed images of aircraft graveyards, dozens of B-17s and B-24s photographed at bases across England, their aluminum skin perforated with patterns that looked almost decorative from a distance. Up close, each hole represented a moment when death had brushed past American air crews at 300 miles per hour. Milton Friedman, barely 30 and already showing the intellectual intensity that would later win him a Nobel Prize, traced damage patterns with his finger. "The concentration is unmistakable," he said, adjusting wire-rimmed glasses that had fogged in the heated room. "Wings take the heaviest punishment, then the rear fuselage sections. The nose sections show surprisingly light damage." Around the table, Leonard Savage and Harold Hotelling nodded in agreement. These men would reshape economics and statistics in peacetime. But today they were solving a more immediate equation: how to keep American boys alive over the skies of occupied Europe. The data spoke with mathematical certainty. Returning bombers showed bullet holes clustered heavily on wing surfaces and rear fuselage sections, with some aircraft bearing damage so extensive that flight engineers marveled they had remained airborne. A B-24 from the 306th Bomb Group had returned to Thorpe, with 73 separate punctures in its port wing alone, the aluminum so shredded it resembled lace. The crew had nursed home on prayer and remaining engine power, touching down just as fuel exhaustion would have claimed them over the English Channel. Military logic aligned perfectly with visible evidence. If German fighters were concentrating fire on wings and fuselage sections, American aircraft needed armor in those exact locations. Wright Field engineers had already begun developing additional protective plating, calculating weight distributions that could reinforce vulnerable areas without compromising flight characteristics. The solution seemed not just obvious, but mathematically verified by hundreds of damage reports flowing in from 8th Air Force bases. But mathematical verification and mathematical truth occupied different universes, and Abraham Wald inhabited the latter. At 41, Wald carried himself with the careful posture of a man who had learned that intellectual precision could mean survival. Born in Cluj in what had been Austria-Hungary and was now Romania under Nazi influence, he had fled to America in 1938 as fascist policies began strangling Jewish academics across Europe. His family remained behind, their fate growing more uncertain with each Wehrmacht victory. Now classified as an enemy alien by the same government seeking his mathematical expertise, Wald worked under restrictions that prohibited him from accessing certain classified materials, while simultaneously asking him to solve problems that could determine the war's outcome. Where his colleagues saw data patterns, Wald saw data structure. Where they observed damage concentrations, he recognized sampling limitations. His mind operated like a mathematical microscope, focusing not on what evidence revealed, but on what assumptions evidence required. As Wallace distributed the latest batch of aircraft damage assessments, Wald remained silent, his attention fixed not on the photographs, but on something that existed only in his mathematical imagination. The conference room filled with the productive noise of collaborative analysis. Friedman sketched probability distributions on a blackboard, calculating optimal armor placement based on damage frequencies. Savage developed risk assessments that weighed protection benefits against performance penalties. The group's dozen researchers worked with the focused intensity of people who understood that their equations would be welded onto aircraft within weeks, tested in combat, where theoretical errors became obituaries. Only Wald seemed detached from the collaborative energy, his attention drifting between damage, reports, and a legal pad covered with notations that looked more like philosophical observations than mathematical calculations. While his colleagues quantified visible damage, he found himself obsessed with a question that felt almost metaphysical. What could they learn from airplanes that weren't in the room? The insight arrived not as dramatic revelation, but as quiet mathematical certainty. Wald looked up from his legal pad, his expression carrying the particular intensity of someone who had just recognized a fundamental error in reasoning that everyone else had missed. The bombers they were studying represented a biased sample, not just incomplete, biased in a way that inverted the logic of armor placement. "We're looking at the wrong evidence," he said quietly, his accented English cutting through the room's analytical buzz. Conversation stopped. Friedman paused mid-equation at the blackboard. Wallace looked up from reconnaissance photographs with the expression of a director whose lead actor had just suggested rewriting the entire script. Wald stood, moving to the blackboard where Friedman's damage distribution charts covered 3 panels. With deliberate precision, he drew a simple aircraft silhouette, then began marking areas with mathematical symbols rather than damage counts. "These aircraft returned to base," he said, indicating the photographs scattered across the conference table. "They are survivors. They tell us where aircraft can sustain damage and continue flying. They do not tell us where damage causes aircraft to be lost." The room's silence carried the weight of recognition. Mathematical minds that had been focused on visible evidence suddenly confronted the logical structure underlying that evidence. The bombers they were studying had survived despite their damage. The bombers that mattered most, those that revealed truly vulnerable areas, were scattered across the European countryside, their crews buried in foreign soil or imprisoned in stalag camps. 3 weeks after the Schweinfurt revelation, W. Wallace found himself walking the humid corridors of the Pentagon, carrying a briefcase that contained what might be the most counterintuitive military analysis of the war. The April heat had turned Washington into a steam bath. But inside the War Department's newly constructed maze of offices, air conditioning created an artificial environment where mathematical theories could be transformed into operational doctrine. Wallace had requested this meeting, not because Wald's insight was particularly complex, but because convincing military planners to armor aircraft where damage appeared lightest would require more than equations. In Conference Room 3 Alpha, Brigadier General Curtis Lame sat across from Colonel Malcolm Moss, the Army Air Force's Chief of Aircraft Modification. Lame's reputation preceded him like the contrails of his bomber formations, a tactician who had revolutionized formation flying and was already being whispered about for Pacific Command. Moss represented the engineering side of air warfare, the practical reality of weight calculations and structural modifications that turned theoretical improvements into operational advantages. Between them, they controlled decisions that would determine whether Wald's mathematical insight became military doctrine or academic curiosity. Wallace, opened his briefcase with the practiced precision of a man who had learned to present complex ideas to audiences that measured success in lives saved rather than theoretical elegance. Gentlemen, the Statistical Research Group has identified a fundamental error in our approach to aircraft armor placement, he began, spreading reconnaissance photographs across the polished conference table. The images showed the now familiar patterns of damage concentration. Wings riddled with bullet holes, fuselage sections perforated by cannon fire, aircraft that had somehow remained airborne despite structural damage that seemed incompatible with controlled flight. Lame studied the photographs with the focused attention of someone who had personally flown bombing missions and understood that each puncture mark represented a moment when American crews had faced death at 25,000 feet. "Professor Wallace," he said, his voice carrying the flat Midwestern tone that had become familiar to bomber crews across England. "These images confirm what our damage assessment teams have been reporting for months. German fighters are concentrating fire on wing surfaces and rear fuselage sections. Our armor placement should obviously reflect these patterns, the response Wallace had expected, even prepared for. Military thinking operated on empirical evidence and practical experience, trusting what could be seen and measured over theoretical constructs that contradicted operational reality. But Wald's insight demanded precisely the opposite approach, trusting mathematical logic over visible evidence, inference over observation, probability theory over common sense. Colonel Moss spread technical drawings across the conference table, detailed schematics showing proposed armor placement that corresponded exactly to observed damage patterns. Wright Field has developed armor configurations that add approximately 800 pounds to standard B-17 specifications, he explained, indicating reinforcement zones that covered wing surfaces and rear fuselage areas. Weight distribution analysis suggests we can protect the most vulnerable areas without significantly compromising flight characteristics or bomb load capacity. Wallace recognized the moment that would determine whether months of statistical analysis would influence military policy or remain an academic exercise. He reached into his briefcase and withdrew a single sheet of paper, covered with Wald's mathematical notations, equations that looked deceptively simple but represented a complete inversion of conventional logic. "The aircraft we're studying," Wallace said carefully, "represent a biased sample. They return to base despite sustaining damage. They prove that aircraft can survive hits to wings and fuselage sections. They tell us nothing about hits to areas that cause aircraft to be lost." He paused, allowing the implication to settle. "The mathematical analysis suggests we should armor the areas showing the least damage on returning aircraft, because those are the areas where hits prevent aircraft from returning at all." The silence that followed carried the weight of institutional inertia confronting mathematical insight. Lame's expression shifted from polite attention to something approaching skepticism. Colonel Moss looked up from his armor schematics with the expression of an engineer whose fundamental assumptions had just been challenged by abstract theory. "Professor Lame," he said slowly, "you're suggesting we ignore visible evidence in favor of theoretical speculation about aircraft we can't examine because they've been shot down." His tone remained professional, but the underlying question was clear. Why should combat-tested military judgment defer to academic mathematics? Wallace had anticipated the resistance, even understood it. Military culture valued proven methods and empirical evidence over theoretical innovation, especially when lives hung in the balance. But Wald's analysis wasn't theoretical speculation. It was mathematical necessity, as logically certain as arithmetic. The challenge lay in translating mathematical certainty into language that operational commanders could accept. "The evidence isn't theoretical," Wallace replied, opening a folder that contained detailed statistical analysis of bomber loss rates correlated with mission profiles and target types. "Dr. Abraham Wald has developed probability models that account for missing data, aircraft that don't return to provide damage reports. His analysis suggests that hits to engine compartments, fuel systems, and cockpit areas are disproportionately represented among aircraft losses, even though these areas show minimal damage on survivors." Colonel Moss studied the statistical charts with the careful attention of someone accustomed to translating theoretical concepts into engineering specifications. "You're asking us to add armor weight to areas that show light damage based on mathematical inference about aircraft we can't examine," he said. That's a significant departure from evidence-based modification protocols. The fundamental tension underlying the entire discussion had finally been articulated. Military engineering relied on observable evidence and tested procedures, while Wald's insight demanded faith in mathematical logic that contradicted visible patterns. Success would require not just convincing military planners that the mathematics were correct, but that mathematical correctness should override operational experience. Lame leaned back in his chair, his expression reflecting the particular burden of command decisions that would determine whether bomber crews returned home or became statistics in German prisoner-of-war camps. "Professor Wallace," he said finally, "I need to understand how confident your mathematician is in this analysis, because if he's wrong, we're adding useless weight to aircraft that are already struggling with performance margins. If he's right." He paused, the implication hanging in the artificially cooled air. "If he's right, we've been making decisions that cost American lives." Wallace recognized the moment as pivotal, not just for Wald's analysis, but for the broader question of how mathematical insight could influence military doctrine. "Dr. Wald stakes his professional reputation on this analysis," he replied. "More than that, he stakes his belief that mathematical reasoning can save American lives. The logic is mathematically sound, even if it contradicts operational intuition." The meeting concluded without resolution, but with agreement to convene a larger review board that would include aircraft designers, combat veterans, and mathematical analysts. As Wallace gathered his materials, he understood that Wald's insight would face its greatest test, not in academic peer review, but in the practical arena, where theoretical elegance had to prove its worth, measured in lives saved and missions completed. The expanded review board convened on a gray Washington morning in late April, bringing together combat veterans who had faced Messerschmitt, cannon fire over Hamburg, and theoretical mathematicians who had never heard a Wright cyclone engine under full power in the Pentagon's conference room 7, Charlie. Two worldviews prepared for collision. Operational experience that trusted what could be seen and touched against mathematical reasoning that insisted the most important evidence was precisely what couldn't be observed. Major Robert Rosenthal occupied the chair reserved for combat experience. At 26, he had already completed 35 missions over Europe, surviving encounters that had claimed most of his original squadron. His B-17 Rosie's riveters bore scars from flak fragments and fighter attacks that had taught him the difference between theoretical vulnerability and combat reality. Rosenthal's presence represented something beyond statistics. He embodied the human cost of armoring decisions. Each modification measured not in weight penalties but in crew survival rates. Across the conference table sat Dr. Harold Hotelling, whose mathematical credentials included pioneering work in statistical inference that would reshape economics after the war. But today, his equations served military necessity. Beside him, Leonard Savage arranged probability calculations with the same methodical precision he brought to decision theory research that academic peers wouldn't fully appreciate for another decade. These men understood that mathematical truth existed independently of human intuition, even when that truth contradicted every instinct developed through practical experience. Abraham Wald entered the conference room carrying a leather portfolio that contained 8 technical memoranda, representing months of analysis. His work had evolved beyond simple contradiction of conventional wisdom into a comprehensive mathematical framework for understanding aircraft vulnerability through survivorship bias. The memoranda bore titles that sounded academic, but addressed questions with immediate operational consequences. A method of estimating plane vulnerability, based on WWII, survivors and sequential analysis of statistical data, theory and practice. General Lame opened the session by acknowledging the fundamental tension they faced. "Gentlemen, we're here to determine whether mathematical theory should override combat experience in aircraft modification decisions," he said, his tone carrying the weight of command responsibility. "Major Rosenthal has flown missions where armor placement meant the difference between completing the bomb run and becoming a casualty. Statistic. Dr. Wald has developed mathematical models that suggest our current approach may be counterproductive." Major Rosenthal spoke with the measured cadence of someone who had learned to communicate essential information efficiently under combat stress. General, I've seen B-17 wings take 50-plus hits from 20mm cannon fire and still maintain structural integrity, he said, indicating reconnaissance photographs that showed damage patterns familiar to every bomber crew. Engine hits are different. One cannon round through a right cyclone and you're flying on 3 engines with reduced power and increased vulnerability. Cockpit hits. He paused, the implication requiring no elaboration. The testimonial carried weight that transcended mathematical analysis. Rosenthal had witnessed the physics of aerial combat at ranges measured in yards, where theoretical probability distributions became immediate matters of crew survival. His aircraft had absorbed punishment that validated current armor placement strategies, returning to base despite structural damage that seemed incompatible with controlled flight. Wald listened with the focused attention he brought to mathematical proofs, recognizing that Rosenthal's experience represented crucial data rather than opposition to his analysis. Major, your observations confirm rather than contradict the mathematical model, he said, opening his portfolio to reveal pages covered with equations and probability calculations. Aircraft returning with extensive wing damage prove that wing hits are survivable. The mathematical question concerns aircraft that sustain engine or cockpit hits, aircraft that don't return to provide damage reports. The response surprised Rosenthal, who had expected theoretical dismissal of practical experience. Instead, Wald was incorporating combat observations into a broader mathematical framework that accounted for both visible evidence and missing data. The approach suggested mathematical sophistication that went beyond academic theory into operational analysis. Dr. Hotelling spread statistical charts across the conference table, displaying loss rates correlated with mission profiles, target types, and aircraft configurations. The mathematical analysis doesn't dispute that wing damage is common among survivors, he explained, indicating data points that confirmed observable damage patterns. Rather, it suggests that certain types of damage are disproportionately represented among aircraft, losses creating systematic bias in damage. Reports from returning aircraft. Colonel Moss studied the statistical presentations with the careful attention of an engineer accustomed to translating theoretical concepts into hardware specifications. Dr. Wald, you're asking us to modify aircraft based on mathematical inference about damage we can't directly observe, he said. That's a significant departure from evidence-based engineering protocols, but the objection represented more than engineering conservatism. It reflected fundamental epistemological questions about the relationship between observable evidence and mathematical truth. Military engineering relied on tested procedures and empirical validation, while Wald's approach demanded confidence in mathematical reasoning that contradicted visible patterns. Wald recognized the moment as crucial for establishing mathematical methodology as legitimate military intelligence. He moved to the blackboard, drawing aircraft silhouettes that would become familiar symbols in operational research literature. The mathematics are not speculative, he said, beginning calculations that would formalize the relationship between observed damage patterns and aircraft vulnerability. Probability theory provides methods for inferring missing data from available samples. The equations he developed represented more than abstract mathematics. They constituted a new methodology for understanding combat effectiveness through statistical analysis by subdividing aircraft into vulnerability zones and calculating downing probabilities based on hit patterns among survivors. Wald was creating mathematical tools that could transform military planning across all domains of warfare. Major Rosenthal watched the mathematical development with growing recognition that Wald's approach complemented rather than contradicted combat experience. Dr. Wald, he said, your analysis explains something we've observed but couldn't quantify. Aircraft with engine damage rarely make it home, even when the damage appears less severe than wing hits that allow continued flight. The acknowledgement marked a breakthrough in the session's dynamic. Rather than abstract theory opposing practical experience, mathematical analysis was providing a framework for understanding observations that combat veterans had made but couldn't systematically evaluate. Wald's equations were giving operational meaning to patterns that existed in combat experience but had never been formally analyzed, Leonard Savage presented probability calculations that estimated vulnerability coefficients for different aircraft zones, translating Wald's theoretical framework into quantitative assessments that could guide engineering decisions. The mathematics suggested that armor placement should prioritize areas where hits caused aircraft losses rather than areas where hits occurred most frequently among survivors. As the session concluded, General Lame faced a decision that would test whether mathematical insight could reshape military doctrine. The choice was no longer between theory and practice, but between different methods of interpreting the same evidence. Wald had demonstrated that mathematical reasoning could provide intelligence that direct observation missed, revealing patterns hidden within the structure of available data. The weeks following, the Pentagon Review transformed Wald's mathematical insight into operational doctrine through a process that resembled academic peer review conducted at wartime pace. In his Columbia University office, now equipped with a secure telephone line and filing cabinets that required security clearance to access, Wald worked 18-hour days developing the technical memoranda that would formalize his approach to aircraft vulnerability assessment. Each document represented not just mathematical analysis but a complete methodology for understanding combat effectiveness through statistical inference. The first memorandum, a method of estimating plane vulnerability based on damage of survivors, established the theoretical framework that would revolutionize military analysis. Wald divided aircraft into discrete vulnerability zones, engine compartments, fuel systems, cockpit areas, wing structures, and tail assemblies, then developed probability calculations for estimating downing rates based on hit patterns among returning aircraft. The mathematics were elegant in their simplicity. Areas showing minimal damage on survivors represented zones where hits prevented survival, while areas showing extensive damage proved their non-critical nature for flight continuation. Working alongside a team of young women computers who operated Marchant desktop calculators with the precision of concert pianists, Wald transformed damage reports from hundreds of bombing missions into statistical data sets that revealed patterns invisible to conventional analysis. Mary Chen, a Berkeley mathematics graduate whose family had been relocated to internment camps while she contributed to the war effort, calculated vulnerability coefficients for B-17 engine compartments that would guide armor placement decisions across the entire 8th Air Force. Her work, classified at levels that prevented her from discussing it with her own family, demonstrated how mathematical reasoning could extract intelligence from data that had previously seemed random. The second memorandum addressed the practical challenge of translating mathematical insight into engineering specifications. Sequential analysis of statistical data, theory and practice provided right-field engineers with quantitative methods for optimizing armor placement based on weight constraints and performance requirements. Rather than simply recommending engine compartment protection, Wald developed algorithms that balanced vulnerability reduction against operational limitations, creating armor configurations that maximize crew survival probability within acceptable performance penalties. Colonel Moss found himself reviewing engineering specifications that contradicted every instinct developed through decades of aircraft modification experience. The proposed armor configurations concentrated protective plating around engine mounts, fuel system components, and cockpit areas, exactly the zones showing minimal damage on returning aircraft. Wing surfaces, which bore the most visible battle damage, would receive reduced protection under Wald's mathematical guidance. The inversion felt counterintuitive, even reckless, but the underlying calculations demonstrated logical consistency that empirical engineering couldn't challenge. At Wright Field, the Army Air Force's primary aircraft modification facility, engineers began manufacturing prototype armor configurations based on Wald's vulnerability assessments. The work required developing new installation techniques for protecting engine compartments without interfering with maintenance access or cooling airflow. Master Sergeant Tony Kowalski, whose mechanical expertise had kept B-17s operational through the harsh conditions of English airfields, found himself installing armor plates in locations that seemed to ignore obvious battle damage patterns. "It feels wrong," he confided to his crew chief. "But the math guys say they know something we don't." The first operational test came in May 1943, when the 91st Bomb Group received 12 B-17s modified according to Wald specifications. The aircraft featured reinforced engine compartments, additional cockpit protection, and fuel system shielding that added approximately 600 pounds to standard configurations. Wing surfaces, traditionally armored based on visible damage patterns, carried reduced protective plating that saved weight for critical system protection. Major James Stewart, commanding the modified aircraft during missions over occupied France, initially approached the new armor configurations with professional skepticism. His combat experience suggested that wing damage represented the primary threat to aircraft survival, making reduced wing protection seem like dangerous experimentation with crew safety. But mathematical analysis had convinced higher command that visible damage patterns provided misleading intelligence about actual vulnerability. The operational results began accumulating through mission, reports that tracked aircraft survival rates across different armor configurations. Modified B-17s equipped with Wald's vulnerability-based protection showed measurably improved survival rates during missions over heavily defended targets. The differences appeared subtle at first, perhaps 2% improvement in aircraft return rates, but aggregated across hundreds of missions. Mathematical precision translated into dozens of crews who returned home instead of becoming casualty statistics. Flight Lieutenant David Williams, whose modified B-17 absorbed direct cannon hits from Focke-Wulf 190s during a bombing run over Wilhelmshaven, provided testimony that validated Wald's mathematical reasoning through brutal empirical testing. The engine compartment armor stopped what should have been a mission-ending hit, he reported during post-flight debriefing. Previous aircraft configurations would have lost that engine completely. We maintained power and made it back to base with all crew members. The accumulating evidence convinced even skeptical combat veterans that mathematical analysis had revealed patterns hidden within operational experience. Major Rosenthal, initially resistant to theoretical approaches that contradicted visible damage patterns, began advocating for expanded implementation of Wald's armor configurations. The mathematics work, he acknowledged during a command briefing. Aircraft modified according to vulnerability analysis show improved survival rates that justify the approach. By summer 1943, Wright Field had received authorization to modify existing bomber fleets according to Wald specifications. The retrofit program required establishing new production lines for engine compartment armor, developing installation procedures for cockpit protection systems, and training maintenance crews in techniques that prioritized areas showing minimal battle damage. The scale of implementation reflected institutional acceptance that mathematical reasoning could guide military hardware decisions more effectively than conventional engineering approaches. The broader implications extended beyond aircraft modification into questions about the relationship between statistical analysis and military planning. Wald's methodology provided a template for applying mathematical reasoning to problems where direct observation provided incomplete or misleading information. The approach suggested that operational research, the systematic application of scientific methods to military problems, could reveal intelligence invisible to conventional analysis. Dr. Wallace found himself coordinating between academic, mathematicians, and military planners who were recognizing that statistical inference could transform how armed forces understood combat effectiveness. The statistical research group's work had demonstrated that mathematical models could extract actionable intelligence from incomplete data, suggesting applications across domains ranging from submarine warfare to ammunition logistics. The 8 technical memoranda that emerged from Wald's analysis represented more than aircraft armor recommendations. They established operational research as a legitimate military discipline. The mathematical techniques Wald developed for understanding survivorship bias would influence post-war approaches to medical research, business strategy, and policy analysis. What began as an attempt to improve bomber survival rates had become a fundamental contribution to scientific methodology. As 1943 progressed toward its violent conclusion, Wald's influence on aircraft modification policy provided tangible validation that mathematical reasoning could save American lives. The abstract equations he had developed in Columbia University's classified conference rooms were now welded onto bombers flying missions over the heart of Nazi Germany. protecting crews who would never know that a Hungarian refugee's mathematics stood between them and Luftwaffe cannon fire. By January 1944, the strategic bombing campaign over Europe had evolved into a war of attrition that consumed aircraft and crews at rates that threatened the entire operation's sustainability. The 8th Air Force was losing bombers faster than American factories could replace them, despite production lines that operated around the clock and drew workers from across the continental United States. In this context, Wald's mathematical approach to vulnerability analysis represented more than theoretical improvement. It had become essential to maintaining operational capacity against increasingly effective German air defenses. The implementation of vulnerability-based armor configurations proceeded through institutional channels that moved with characteristic military deliberation, while combat crews faced daily missions over targets defended by concentrations of anti-aircraft artillery that could fill entire sections of sky with lethal fragments. Engineers at modification centers worked methodically to retrofit existing aircraft fleets according to Wald specifications. The process required balancing immediate operational needs against long-term improvements that would save lives through mathematical precision rather than visible protection. Colonel Moss found himself managing a modification program that challenged fundamental assumptions about aircraft survivability while operating under pressure to maintain mission readiness. Wright Field's production schedules included thousands of bomber modifications that concentrated protective resources on areas showing minimal battle damage, an approach that required constant explanation to maintenance crews whose experience suggested different priorities. The cognitive dissonance was resolved only through accumulating evidence that mathematically guided protection improved survival rates more effectively than conventional approaches. Technical Sergeant Martinez, whose mechanical expertise had maintained B-17s through the brutal conditions of English airfields, discovered that Wald's armor configurations required developing entirely new installation techniques. Engine compartment protection demanded precision that balanced vulnerability reduction against cooling requirements and maintenance accessibility. The math professor's approach makes the work harder, he acknowledged during a training session for maintenance crews, but the aircraft come back more often with crews intact. The broader transformation extended beyond individual aircraft, modifications into systematic changes in how military planners approached problems involving incomplete information. Wald's methodology had demonstrated that statistical inference could reveal patterns hidden within operational data, suggesting applications to challenges ranging from convoy routing to ammunition allocation. The Mathematical Research Group found itself consulting on problems that spanned every domain of modern warfare, applying techniques developed for aircraft vulnerability to questions about submarine effectiveness and logistics optimization. Major Stewart, commanding bomber formations equipped with mathematically optimized protection, observed changes in crew confidence that reflected more than hardware improvements. Air crews flying aircraft modified according to Wald specifications reported increased morale based on understanding that their protection had been designed through scientific analysis rather than conventional assumptions. The psychological impact complemented measurable improvements in survival rates, creating operational advantages that extended beyond pure vulnerability reduction. The statistical validation of Wald's approach accumulated through mission reports that documented survival rates across different aircraft, configurations, and operational conditions. By spring 1944, bombers equipped with vulnerability-based armor showed survival improvements that justified the mathematical methodology, even to initially skeptical combat commanders. The differences appeared subtle in individual missions, but became decisive when aggregated across the hundreds of aircraft that comprised strategic bombing formations. During the intensive operations preceding D-Day, when the 8th Air Force flew maximum effort missions against transportation targets across occupied France, aircraft modified according to Wald specifications demonstrated superior survival characteristics under the most demanding operational conditions. Mission planners who had initially questioned mathematical approaches to vulnerability analysis found themselves requesting additional aircraft equipped with scientifically optimized protection. The practical validation silenced theoretical objections more effectively than academic arguments. The introduction of long-range fighter escorts, particularly the P-51 Mustang, with its revolutionary combination of range and combat effectiveness, created operational conditions that multiplied the benefits of improved bomber survivability. Aircraft that could survive initial attacks long enough for escort fighters to intervene were far more likely to complete their missions and return to base. Wald's vulnerability analysis had anticipated this synergy, designing protection systems that maximized aircraft survivability during the critical moments when escort coverage was absent or engaged with enemy fighters. Dr. Wallace coordinated between mathematical analysts and operational commanders who were recognizing that scientific methodology could transform military planning beyond traditional approaches. The statistical research group's success with aircraft vulnerability had established operational research as essential to modern warfare, creating demand for mathematical analysis across every aspect of military operations. Universities across America began developing programs that would train the operational analysts who would reshape post-war approaches to complex organizational problems. The human cost of mathematical precision became visible through aircrew testimonials that documented survival in circumstances that would have been fatal under previous protection configurations. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Rosenthal, whose combat experience had initially made him skeptical of theoretical approaches, became an advocate for expanded implementation of scientifically designed protection systems. "The mathematics saved my crew," he stated during a War Department briefing. "We took engine hits that should have ended the mission, but the armor held." By late 1944, the combined effects of improved aircraft protection, long-range fighter escort, and tactical evolution had reduced bomber loss rates to levels that made strategic bombing operations sustainable. The transformation represented more than technological improvement. It demonstrated how mathematical reasoning could solve problems that conventional approaches had failed to address effectively. Wald's insight about survivorship bias had become a cornerstone of modern operational analysis. The broader implications extended into post-war applications that would reshape how organizations approached problems involving incomplete information. Medical researchers adopted techniques developed for aircraft vulnerability to understand treatment effectiveness in clinical trials where patient outcomes provided biased samples. Business analysts applied survivorship bias methodology to market research that could be distorted by focusing only on successful companies, while ignoring failures that provided crucial information about competitive dynamics. Abraham Wald continued his mathematical work with the quiet satisfaction of someone whose abstract reasoning had translated into tangible improvements in human survival. The Hungarian refugee who had been classified as an enemy, alien while contributing to American military effectiveness, had proven that mathematical truth could transcend political boundaries and cultural assumptions. His 8 technical memoranda had become foundational documents in operational research, establishing methodologies that would influence decision-making across domains far removed from aircraft armor placement. The war's progression toward Allied victory validated approaches that combined mathematical rigor with operational experience, demonstrating that scientific methodology could enhance rather than replace practical knowledge. Combat veterans and mathematical analysts had learned to collaborate effectively, creating analytical frameworks that incorporated both empirical observation and statistical inference. The partnership suggested possibilities for post-war applications where complex problems required both practical experience and theoretical sophistication. As 1944 drew toward its conclusion, the strategic bombing campaign had achieved objectives that seemed impossible during the dark period following Pearl Harbor. American bombers were flying deep into German airspace with survival rates that made sustained operations feasible, protected by armor configurations that prioritized areas where mathematics rather than conventional wisdom suggested vulnerability existed. The transformation represented victory not just for Allied military planning, but for scientific reasoning applied to problems of life and death consequence.